gold trails and ghost towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee, and we're here to finish a story, or at least put a bit of a finish to a story. We started a few years ago about the Kettle Valley Railway. We did the eastern portion, but now the western portion.
Yeah, we really haven't concentrated on the western portion, and this was a very difficult engineering job. There's no doubt about it. They had to go through the Coquihalla Pass, sometimes called impassable, sometimes impossible.
Yeah.
And not much doubt about it. Rivalry between Thomas Shaughnessy, head of the CPR, and the famous James Jerome Hill, who was the empire builder of the Great Northern Railway.
Now, the Great Northern was ahead by a long, long reach over the CPR at circa what, 1906? What are we talking about here?
About 1909. They were light years ahead of the CPR. There's not much doubt about it. And if we look at this map,
this
Mike,
is just the most amazing map.
It is the map that tells the whole story.
Hang on to that corner
of
for me, will you?
Of the CPR versus the VV&E or the Great Northern.
Yeah.
One of their subsidiaries was the VV&E.
There's the American border.
Yeah.
And every time you see one of these little beige peaks jutting up into Canada, here up to Nelson, here into Rossland, here into Phoenix, and all the way along here, those are areas that the Great Northern said, we're moving in there.
All strategic. Even at the south part of Kootenai Lake, you'll see there's a little jump up in there, and you say, well, why? You can see the coal fields beyond that.
Yep.
But the south part of Kootenai Lake, right down here, they wanted to send stern wheelers up Kootenai Lake to get to Ryandale, to get to Ainsworth, to get to Caslow, to get to the Silvery Slocan.
And James J. was ahead of the CPR in doing that.
Oh, sure.
They're heading right now, it's 1909, they're heading for Princeton because of Copper Mountain.
That's right.
And so, zooming into this country, they're going to win the run across southern British Columbia.
Sure, and remember, they've already won part of that run all the way across. They've taken Headley, and Headley was one of the great gold camps of southern British Columbia in the early 1900s with the nickel plate and mountains of ore pouring out of there. Then they jump into Princeton. One of their goals there, one of their targets there, of course, is the Copper Mountain Mine. And the CPR decides to take notice, and they decide they have to fight James Jerome Hill. They don't want him to get to Vancouver. And it means that they have to put their best men against him, and one of their best men is Andrew McCullough. And this is interesting, Mike, because Andrew McCullough was acknowledged as probably the best surveyor, the best builder of rail lines in Canada. In the United States, only one man stands out. James Jerome Hill is the best builder of rail lines, an ex-Canadian, in the United States. So it's James Jerome Hill against Andrew McCullough, the CPR, versus the VV&E, which is really the Great Northern.
So this is overtime. This is for all the marbles.
You bet.
Maybe even for Canadian sovereignty. A lot of people thought this at the time.
Yeah.
We'll continue the story of KVR West, J.J. Hill against Andrew McCullough right after these words. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee talking about the KVR West today. It's the Princeton subdivision, an area just to the west of Penticton. I'm just always wondering, though, why is it that the CPR is always behind? Why did JJ have the speed and we didn't?
Well, JJ was looking well down into the future. He was a general in railroad building. He wanted to beat the CPR because the CPR had taken some contracts from him. And it goes way, way back, decades back in James J. Hill's rivalry with the CPR. So he's already at Princeton, and the CPR is just leaving Penticton, and they have some obstacles to overcome, Mike. Here they are building over the Trout Creek Canyon, and this is a magnificent undertaking.
Now, isn't this the one where McCullough is said to have said, I think it's 200 feet 3 inches, and he was out by what?
They said it was such. His engineer said it was such and such. He says, I think you're out a little bit. I think you're out about an inch and a half. And he went down and he measured it all himself, triangulated the whole darn thing. They were out about an inch and a half. And that's
so this kind of
yeah.
this is the kind of reputation McCullough
sure.
brings to this game.
Sure. McCullough, when the engineers examined McCullough's line building and what he'd done on the eastern part of the KVR, the inspectors that went through that said it was the best line they'd ever seen anywhere in all their lives of inspecting.
And it was, I mean, a lot can be said about punching the railway line through the Fraser Canyon, but this, the section between Penticton and Midway, was about as tough a railroad building country as you can do.
Yeah, there's not much doubt about it. The first part out of Penticton, except for that Trout Creek Canyon Bridge, isn't too tough. They go through that, then they start heading west into that Tulameen country.
That's pretty good building country, isn't it? There's a lot of gravel in there.
Yeah, a lot of gravel, but also fairly precipitous in spots. And James J. Hill now decides that he must steal a march on the Kettle Valley Railway, or the CPR. So he anticipates and plans to build an 8-mile tunnel going up the Tulameen River and going right through to avoid that huge snow shed, Mike. And he really had planned that. But in 1907, something had changed. His son Louis takes over, and Louis looks like his father, almost a spitting image, but he isn't cut from the same cloth.
Oh dear. So this impetus, this, as you call him, railroad general, has to hand off to his lieutenant, and
right.
They lose some speed, some impetus.
The lieutenant hasn't earned his commission very well. And so the CPR realizes they're going along and they're building through this country and encountering some difficulties that they can probably deal with the VV&E or the Great Northern. And indeed they can deal with Louis Hill.
Now, how do they do this? I mean, you can't send out gangs of men to beat up the other guys. No. I mean, what was the technique for impeding the progress of the VV&E?
Well, the CPR tried to impede progress of the VV&E all the way along the line, throwing injunctions at them and everything else. And, of course, James J. Hill would reply with his battery of lawyers. Lewis Hill was not, as I say, cut from the same cloth. He eventually comes to some accommodation with the CPR, the Kettle Valley Railway.
Given the fact that he's that far ahead, he gives in. What does he decide to do?
They decide to share the lines and some of the services, and but essentially the Vancouver Victoria and Eastern, or the Great Northern, takes a subsidiary role. They take a secondary role. They're no longer king of the pass.
Junior partner.
That's right. They are indeed.
Gee, that's almost breathtaking to find that change, because. I mean, it's not like Hill ran out of money, and he's got how many millions of dollars in the bank?
Well, James J. Hill, before he dies, is in very, very good shape. So right in that era, he's probably at the height of his power. And what happens, of course, is that James J. Hill dies in 1916. He leaves behind an estate of $53 million, which was, by today's standards, not much. By the standards of 1916, really quite staggering. One of the great railroad giants of not just the United States, but of the world.
And would he be using his own monies to build this, or he would?
He never got a penny from the United States government, and of course he didn't get that from Canada either. So, he left the railroad in very, very good shape for his son. But his son caved to the superior tactics of the KVR.
Okay, and now, so the KVR says, all right, we're alone in this game now. Right. But why didn't they, as we talk about this a little later, we'll find out, why didn't they go that 8-mile tunnel through there? Because the disasters that they were facing were huge.
I don't think they were aware that the Coquihalla area is one of the great areas of the world for a snow belt. I mean, it would snow up to 50 feet a year. That's absolutely unbelievable. And they thought they could get around that and handle it like every other snow belt. They'd handle the Rockies, and they'd handle the Montachis and the Purcells, and you name it, but they hadn't seen anything like that.
Okay. Lots of money to be had just being into Princeton. I mean, Headley was already in James J. Hill's pocket, but when they got to Princeton, Copper Mountain was obviously a great gem to have there.
And Copper Mountain, eventually the CPR did put a line into Copper Mountain, and it was a mountain of ore, discovered by our old friend Volcanic Brown and a guy called Jameson, and proved to be a very, very good feeder line for the KVR. And here you see with their spur line running up into Copper Mountain. I remember that well as a kid.
It was no simple line either.
No, it isn't. And later it was used as a road when they abandoned the railway. But it was a very, very tricky line indeed. But it carried ore out of Copper Mountain for decades, literally for decades.
It would go down, I guess, to Allenby was the mill that was doing it there.
You can see where it stopped here, and this is a great shot of the workings down at Allenby itself.
Yeah. Whenever I read about history, there's always a sort of a little toss-away phrase line that the railway, this section of the line was finished in 19 whatever.
Yeah.
But that doesn't tell the story, does it? I mean, how tough was that line to build?
Well, it was very, very tough. And, you know, I call that line from Brookmere right down through to Iago and past that down through Jessica and right down to Hope. I call it the Shakespearean line because we mentioned it once before years and years ago on the program that our friend Andrew McCullough, was a great reader of Shakespeare. He would spend half his time, any spare time he had, reading the plays of Shakespeare, could quote it at length, actually quote for several hours in a row without missing a line. And he called them Othello and Romeo, Juliet, Iago, Shylock, you name it. Those were some of those stopping places all the way down from Brookmere right down to Hope.
It's kind of interesting. I've heard it said that he named Iago Station Iago because he's the great villain of Shakespeare, and this was the roughest part, the most brutal part of this line.
Sure. Well, when you take a look at some of these photos, Mike, that we've got of the Coquihalla line and some of the trestles, I mean, really quite staggering. This was monumental work coming through some mountainous country that most people would not have tackled. And so the trestles and the bridges over the Coquihalla were really quite breathtaking in many areas.
You just couldn't be afraid of heights and do any of this kind of stuff because it's scary.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, again, I wonder why they would ever forsake an 8-mile tunnel when they tried what they did at Quintet.
Yeah.
Quintet is almost magic to think of, isn't
sure
it?
it is.
Tell me about Quintet.
Well, Quintet they looked at that part of the river and they said, well, the Coquihalla, and they said, I don't think we can build here. I really don't think we can challenge it. And they brought in McCullough, and McCullough looked at it with his great eye, of course, Mike, and he said, I think we can. If we drive 5 tunnels through here, that's why the Quintet tunnels. And it really was a marvelous feat of engineering. And here's, in fact, several shots, early photographs of the Quintet tunnels. And it made railroading history really all the way across the continent. And people still marvel at it.
Yeah. The other thing that I really marvel at, or I note when I watch the completion of the KVR, not only to bring Shakespeare into it all, but he began, I mean, Jellicoe, for example, a famous British naval captain, well, he names some of these trestles at Jellicoe, this huge trestle at Jellicoe, for example.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, he brought history right to the line.
Yeah, he did.
And a sort of a musical, like calling these tunnels the Quintet. What a lovely...
Oh, yeah. He had a magical way with words as well as engineering, and generally self-taught. But some of the guys along the line, a lot of them had nicknames. Coquihalla Red, who was James Porteous, one of the Porteous family. And he was stationed at one of those little whistle spots up there, and he used to watch the Eagles. And the more he watched the Eagles, the more they taught him. And then he noticed something peculiar happening. When the Eagles flew across the canyon, there was an avalanche, or an avalanche coming. When they flew straight up the canyon, it was fine. So he watched them, they flew up the canyon, train had no problems at all. When it flew across the canyon, he'd start getting the work crews out. And they were, according to him, and people who watched said, yes, he was right. They were absolutely perfect in their perception of when an avalanche was coming and when an avalanche wasn't coming. Yeah. And when you look at this line, and Mike, here are some absolutely remarkable shots showing the snow and the depth of the snow in the Coquihalla.
People would talk about it snowing a foot an hour all night long, so you could have 18 feet of snow out of one dump.
Oh, yeah, it was
and one of those big rotary plows, even that would be tough.
Yeah,
and right after you got to finish, there'd be another 18 feet of snow.
Of course. Staggering. I had some of the old notes on the first construction crews that went through, and I didn't bring them with me today, and they were just absolutely flabbergasted at the amount of snow that came down the Coquihalla.
And that was just naturally falling snow. Then it would all fall off the avalanche down the hillsides.
Yeah, it was astonishing.
And derails upon derails, I would imagine.
Oh, sure.
All right, so it was difficult country. And in fact, it was lethal country. And when we come back from this break, we're going to talk about some of the mishaps and one particular mishap which took a lot of lives. And we'll do that as we continue our look at the KVR West. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barley talking about the completion of the KVR West from really Penticton through to Hope, which was the, I guess, western terminus.
Yeah.
And there's something that also occurs to me. You call it the VV&E, the Victoria, Vancouver and Eastern is the Great Northern's line in Canada.
Yep.
Now, they had to get a special charter to have a line in. So this is...
Yeah, they did.
This was okayed by government to have the Great Northern up here.
It was. The CPR was not liked by in some branches of government, so they decided to give them a little bit of rivalry so they wouldn't have the territory to themselves. Indeed, they gave them more than a little bit of rivalry. They gave them one of the great competitors in the Northwest.
So that was really the only balance that even the government had to control the CPR.
Yeah.
I see. I kind of missed that, but then I began thinking about it, and that was potentially the reason for it. Okay. We've got this line built through the biggest snow belt in North America, virtually.
Yeah, it is.
But it has nothing to do with snow. The greatest disaster on the KVR, and that took place 1926.
Yeah, it did take place in 1926, and September the 5th, 1926,
right around Labor Day.
Was Labor Day Sunday, actually, and typical run pulling into Brookmere. The train stops there. There are about at least 12 young boys ranging in age probably from 16 to 17 or 18 had been picking apples in the Okanagan. That never did come out completely, Mike.
And they're riding, what, riding the rails?
They're riding the rods, that's right. And Bob Marks is the engineer on the main train, and a guy called Ray Letts is the fireman, and Ole Johnson is the brakeman on the head part of the train.
What's the train carrying here?
The train is carrying, besides the 12 or so individuals who came back from apple picking in the Okanagan, it's carrying a fairly heavy load of lead and zinc ingots from the Trail smelter. And but this was not unusual. They'd carried those before, and an experienced engineer. But they had a pusher, and the pusher is the engineer there is Smokey Clapperton, and a guy called Bob Barwick is with him, as well as another guy called Quinn. And
because it's so heavy, they need the second engine to try and maneuver it over the land.
Sure. And so the first part of the trip, and they leave Brookmere Hotel, relatively early, and they have no difficulty. Don't encounter any difficulties at all. And they're careful because this is a tough line. And they get down to about Iago, and they stop there to let the brakes cool off. And
they've actually got a great chunk of the downhill run already covered.
Sure they have.
And they've got to just obviously go slow, keep the brakes on. Yeah. Okay, what do they do in Iago?
So they, after they stayed at Iago at the appropriate time, they pull out of Iago, and the engineer, Marks, notices the train is going a little faster than they thought. So he puts on the air, doesn't work.
You mean he applies the brakes and there's nothing there?
There's nothing there at all. And Letts says, I've got it all on. And they keep on gaining a head of steam. And this is really rolling through this very precipitous country with trestles and bridges and tunnels all over the place. And finally Marks realizes he is not going to stop this train. And he tells Letts to jump for it. But Letts follows Johnson back, and they start setting the handbrakes, hoping they can slow it down.
On top of every one of the boxcars, there's one of those handbrakes applied to the wheel.
That's right, and the boxcars are swaying back and forth because the train is rocketing along, and these guys are on top setting the handbrakes, but they're unable to stop it. In the pusher train, which is tied on to the main train, they decide they've got to do something about it too. And a guy called Bob Barwick, he unhooks, and hoping that they can hold their 10 cars back. The first train is carrying, they're not sure exactly how many cars. There were a lot of funny things done with the records. And so anyway...
They figure something around 26 cars though, right?
Yeah, they do. That's one of the versions. Other versions vary on either side of that.
Now, just saying Barwick had to unhook, what did Barwick have to do to unhook? Because he's aboard the locomotive in the middle of this train.
He had to run along that swaying locomotive to unhook as well. And this was a very, very difficult task. He was able to do it, and Smokey Clapperton was able to put the brakes on the pusher, and they saved the pusher and everybody on board the pusher. But the other train keeps going through and heads towards Jessica and around that very circuitous route, which is going through probably the worst of the Coquihalla. And they almost make it to Jessica, but not quite. And one of the station hands at Jessica comes out. I think it was one of the Rascala family, and he hears what he thought was an avalanche which was unlikely, but
September, yeah.
Well, it's September, but it could be a landslide
or
a rock slide of some type.
It's just
but
a
it
roar.
becomes louder. It's a huge roar, and he is amazed, and it becomes louder and louder as he looks out past. He's sitting on the porch. He's going to have a late morning smoke actually, and he sees the train hurtle into the Jessica siding, and 3 or 4 of the cars break right off and just simply disintegrate, absolutely disintegrate. And the others carry on down the track. He sees them hurtle by, and then he hears a crash. And then he hears absolutely nothing, total silence. And the whole train had been absolutely destroyed. Everyone on board was killed except Letts, who was thrown off or jumped off and hit a pile of cinders.
So he survived.
So Letts survives.
But
and of course the pusher train survives as well.
But the 12 or so young kids who were riding the rails on this summer adventure are dead?
Are definitely.
Will they
and
ever
it burns to a
mention?
crisp. Well, it is. There was an inquiry by the CPR, and then there was an official inquiry, and they found many more dead than the CPR did. The total toll will probably never be known, Mike. We just don't know how many were killed in that. And it's really strange, because Bob Barwick was eventually, because of his bravery, and became known all across the continent, he was promoted to engineer. And in 1930, just 4 years later, he was killed in a wreck just a few hundred yards from where he'd unhooked the original train when the great train wreck of September 5th, 1926.
Went down on that. Yeah. Liz, there's a lot of this ghost story kind of thing associated with railways, a lot of this coincidence.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it.
Don't you have a story, maybe not on the same line, about a ghost train?
Yeah, I do, but that's a long story, and we require more time than we have.
All right, maybe next time.
So, but the interesting thing too, when you examine the KVR, and this looks like poor management, it wasn't. The KVR ran some of the roughest country in the world, some of the most difficult terrain, had one of the best accident records on the continent, actually. And those KVR engineers and the brakemen and everybody else on the line were extremely proud of the line. And you can see why. I mean, here are a couple of pictures. There's the KVR.
I work on that. This is a heroic thing to be able to say.
Oh, sure. And everybody I knew guys who worked on the KVR, and some of them there for a lifetime. There's not much doubt about it. And I can understand why they loved the old line. So
there's a great book recently been written. It's called Vader's Caboose.
Yeah.
And George Matheson wrote it in conjunction with the Vader family, who worked on the KVR, and for James J. Hill. Yeah. You know the Vader family.
Sure, Frank Vader, I know him very well, and I know his wife, and have known them for about 30-odd years. And so that's a good book. Certainly.
In there he tells the story about a request that an RCMP constable made, wanting to reopen the inquiry into this, because I think the CPR claimed to have lost 50 cars when only maybe 26 were lost.
That's right,
and didn't mention in the CPR official inquiry the 12 kids.
That's right. It was a bit of a job I think they'd done on it. Yeah.
Very interesting stuff there.
So really, I think it's a testimony to, it's a monument to the old railroad builder, certainly to Andrew McCullough, certainly to all the guys who ran on the KVR.
The story is the KVR, the western section, the Princeton subdivision, from Penticton through to Hope, and some great stories. If you want to look up other stories, Barry Sanford's book, McCullough's Wonder, is a superb one to read. And for anecdotes, Al Reeder's got a book as well that's filled with photographs. And don't forget Vader's Caboose, another that tells some of the anecdotes of the Vader family on the KVR. Thanks again.
Okay, Mike.
See you next time on Gold Trails.